It's called critical race theory.
Critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
Critical race theory has become a conservative talking point by people who have no idea what it is.
CRT is not an honest dialogue. It is a tactic that was used by Hitler and the Ku Klux Klan on slavery very many years ago to dumb down my ancestors.
Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools.
It's about avoiding the hard conversation for the sake of white fragility. We will not allow you to call our history inaccurate or fake news because you can't handle the truth.
It turned physical tonight in Loudoun County, Virginia, just a suburb right here in Washington, D.C.
Let me begin with you. Lay out the terms of the debate from your perspective first. How would you define critical race theory?
So I think we have to be clear about the definitions. It's really important. And what you're hearing now is a debate supposedly over critical race theory, but that's not actually what we're debating. Critical race theory is, in a lot of ways, just a niche section of academia that deals with kind of using laws, institutions, policies to understand how racism, how inequality, how discrimination has been perpetuated.
That definition was less than worthless. Here is a better definition from YouTuber T1J.
Critical race theory as a concept has existed since at least the 1970s and basically seeks to examine how race and racism interact with our understanding of law and politics. It does this by challenging the common liberal wisdom that shrewd rationalism and colorblind impartiality is the best way to solve social problems. They argue that because of the unique history of America, color blindness in any case would only occur as a result of people of color assimilating themselves into the white status quo. They fundamentally disagree with the melting pot analogy for America and other ethnically diverse nations. In some cases, they even seem to support forms of segregation. For example, Derek Bell, one of the pioneers of critical race theory, argued that instead of struggling to integrate into white schools, black people should instead build and bolster their own black schools.
T1J provides what I believe is a desperately needed neutral explanation of critical race theory. And if you have the time, you're probably better off watching his whole video than you are this one, because I am not going to strive for neutrality in any way. Any theory that rationalizes racial segregation is pathological, to say the least. And critical race theory's growing presence in school curriculums and workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion training sessions make it an issue that everyday Americans are going to be forced to effectively pick a side on. But while I think it is morally just to call critical race theory an ideological cancer, just like the critical race theorists and normal people would regard white supremacy as an ideological cancer, doesn't mean you should accept that premise until I've provided enough evidence to convince you otherwise. So don't take my word for it. Here is Columbia University Professor of Linguistics John McWhorter's take on critical race theory.
I think a lot of people feel that to be against this new current in education means that you are a right-wing zealot. But that business of tarring by association gets very sloppy. And the truth is that even if the Trump administration's motives for coming out against CRT, critical race theory, in that way, where what many of us would regard as not ours and perhaps even impure, that doesn't mean that there isn't something really alarming going on in a lot of educational entities these days in terms of what they think of as education to be. And a lot of this is affecting children. And so you and I, for example, are privy privately to what went on at the Dalton School here in New York City, where I am, where apparently the entire curriculum has been turned upside down into these endless indoctrination sessions about the nature of racial oppression in the United States, including role-playing games and separation of people by race, and all of this being done by people who think of themselves on the side of the angels.
Unless you are a dedicated conspiracy theorist, one can hardly describe John McWhorter as a right-winger, and yet he regards education done through the lens of critical race theory as indoctrination. And as I will show you in a moment, I believe that's putting it very lightly. Critical race theory is a complete and utter rejection of the fundamental ideas that many Americans base their lives around, like treating people equally and fairly regardless of their skin color, or believing that logic and rationality are the best tools for solving complex social problems. Like other Marxist ideologies, critical race theory attempts to subvert the ideological foundations of this country and Western capitalist democracies in general, so as to dismantle them and from the ashes bring about a new, morally superior society, just as Karl Marx advocated for. So while T1J claims that conservative media has created hysteria around critical race theory, which I disagree agree with somewhat. He also points out how left-wing media regularly gaslights people into thinking that the description of critical race theory I just provided is somehow inaccurate.
The conservative establishment in America has successfully stirred up hysteria about teaching critical race theory in schools. But the way the left talks about critical race theory isn't always honest either.
If it feels like the 1950s, that's because some prominent Republican outrage peddlers are trying to red scare you about subversive Marxist ideas and stuff.
Conservative leaders have drummed up this false outrage once again about the so-called Marxist philosophy that undermines the very ideals that America was founded on. But here's the thing. Critical race theory is that. The critics take their cues from Marxism, acknowledging up front that ongoing oppression is taking place and an active approach is needed to solve it. But in general, crits call for a complete analytical deconstruction of the liberal ideals that America was founded on.
The desire to deconstruct the fundamental American ideals that our country is built upon is part of a conspiratorial belief that every political, cultural, economic, and legal institution in America was fundamentally designed to uphold white supremacy. And it is this foolishness that causes people to make such horrifically stupid claims like those made by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, who released this infographic in July of 2020. According to the museum, everything on this list is a construct of whiteness, most notably self-reliance and objective, rational, linear thinking. And sure, I can agree that history, as we learn it, is relatively whitewashed and reductive. But if you think that someone who has a win-at-all-costs mentality or personality is internalizing whiteness, then you are literally an idiot.
My innate personality is to win at all costs. If I have to do it myself, I'm gonna do it. Every time I step on that basketball court, my focus is to win the game. It drives me insane when I can't. As you get older, you look back and you understand how you became the person you are. I don't think I would be here without the lessons that I learned at a very young age. That competitiveness within me started when I was a kid.
Yeah, Michael, actually that competitiveness started in 16th century colonial Europe, and you are merely a vessel of white supremacy that was indoctrinated into you as a child, and now that you are rich, we can exclude you on the intersectional framework of which you are now a oppressor along at least one dimension. If you're going to rationalize how self-evidently valuable traits like being competitive or being self-reliant are products of white supremacy, and that people's intrinsic motivations are actually dictated by white supremacy, then it really actually sounds like you believe that whiteness is superior.
What has occurred is sort of the elevation of racism to this sort of omnipotent, amorphous force that is constantly here with us and will constantly be here with us.
This past year has made it painfully clear what Black Americans have always known, that systemic racism pervades every part of our society.
And the problem I have with that argument is that if you think about it to its logical conclusion, the person who believes that white supremacy is omnipotent and the most, let's say, primary force that affects external outcomes, and I'll talk about external outcomes in a few minutes, then one must actually believe in white supremacy to make that argument. One must actually believe that somehow people with a certain skin color are omnipotent and have this incredible power to dictate completely and inexorably the inner lives of all human beings on planet Earth, which is just silly.
So you can understand why people are resistant to critical race theory in their schools and in their workplaces, especially people who are Black, who are told that their success is somehow an internalized form of white supremacy, or that people that look like them are automatically worse off in life.
It is sad that we are even contemplating something like critical race theory, where children will be separated by their skin color and deemed permanently oppressors or oppressed in 2021. That is not teaching the truth, unless you believe that whites are better than Blacks.
I work for myself from off the streets to where I am right now. You gonna sit here and tell me this lie of critical race theory? Of this the reason why Black folks can't get ahead because of white folks? Are you kidding me?
Critical race theory rightfully elicits this kind of reaction from people, and it is this kind of garbage that I believe will lead our country down a dark and terrible path, one of which its intimations of we have all bore witness to over the past year. Neighbors are literally fighting each other at school board meetings, and one of the worst parts about critical race theory is that it makes it more difficult to address actual systemic racism, like the drug war, which was explicitly designed to target black Americans and disproportionately puts black men in prison, which contributes directly to the high rates of fatherlessness, destroying the black community, that conservatives like to harp on. And less consequentially, but still relevant, it also poisons the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion training, because people hear the word DEI and they associate it with narcissistic racists like Robin DiAngelo, when in fact there are very uplifting and humanistic DEI programs like the Theory of Enchantment, which was started by the aforementioned Chloe Valdary. It's programs like the Theory of Enchantment that people should be advocating for in lieu of anything having to do with critical race theory, or whatever conceptual framework describes self-reliance and competitiveness as forms of white supremacy. So now that you've seen this video, you're equipped, you know what the facts are, call it out for what it is, bullshit, because if we don't, then we're not going to be in the Roaring 20s all over again. We'll be in the 1850s, which was the Civil War, and I'd like to avoid that. So, good luck and Godspeed.